Na sequência, teremos a palestra Análise comparativa do desenvolvimento do esporte de alto rendimento, a ser proferida pelo professor Barrie Houlihan. O professor Barrie Houlihan é professor de Políticas Públicas para o Esporte da Universidade de Loughborough, na Inglaterra. Suas pesquisas incluem os processos de políticas nacionais e internacionais para o esporte. É autor ou editor de cerca de 20 livros, entre eles Desenvolvimento comparativo do esporte de alto rendimento, Sistemas, Estruturas e Políticas Públicas, Esporte, Política e Políticas Públicas, Uma Análise comparativa, o Esporte e Política Pública, Administração Esportiva, e de mais de 50 artigos científicos. Além de professor e pesquisador, realizou projetos de consultoria para vários departamentos governamentais do Reino Unido, para a UK Sport England, para o Conselho Europeu, União Europeia, Unesco e Agência Mundial Antidoping. É editor-chefe da revista Internacional de Política Pública do Esporte. Neste momento, aqueles que julgarem necessário poderão retirar o aparelho de tradução simultânea junto à recepção. O setor de Ciências Biológicas da Universidade Federal do Paraná agradece a presença de todos, tenham um bom dia e um ótimo evento.
Good morning. My apology is that I do not speak Portuguese, so I hope I will speak slowly and provide a stimulating presentation for you all. Just wait for the slides to come up. Okay, what I want to talk about this morning is the importance of comparing high-performance sports systems and looking at some of the lessons that we can learn from looking at other countries. So, next slide. So, I want to spend a bit of time asking the question, why do we compare? What do we hope to learn from comparing Brazil with other countries or the UK with other countries? I want then to give you two examples of, I think, a useful comparison. And I want to finish by looking at some of the problems that investment in high-performance sport can produce for countries. So, next slide. So why do we compare? What is the value of spending time looking at other countries? I think, first of all, we can use it to generate models. And one suggestion I will make to you is that when we look at high-performance sports systems, there is a high degree of similarity. Whatever the political system, whatever the country, they tend to produce elite athletes, high-performance athletes, in a very similar way. It also informs policy making. We learn lessons from other countries. And thirdly, it helps us look at our own country with fresh eyes, that we look at what other countries do, and it helps us understand our own country. It also is useful for explaining differences and similarities between countries, that not all countries are identical, and that if you are developing a high-performance sports system, what are the distinctive characteristics of Brazil that you need to take account of. And finally, there are some research questions that can only be answered through comparison. So the impact of globalization requires us to look comparatively. Next slide. In terms of how to compare, that there are a number of different strategies that we can look at across a large number of countries, the 205 that came to the London Olympic Games, but most comparative studies select a small number of countries and investigate them in considerable detail. And I think for understanding elite sports systems, you need to choose countries carefully, but choose a small number and investigate them in detail. A mixture of gathering quantitative data and qualitative data that later on I will show you the ingredients of high-performance sports systems. But what is more important is how those different ingredients or elements are put together. That is, it's an understanding of the qualitative process of making those elements work effectively. And finally, when you're choosing countries, should you choose countries that are similar to your own or quite different? And as I said, when we look at high-performance sports systems, we can take countries that are democracies, that are authoritarian, that are monarchies. They all tend to develop their elite athletes in broadly similar ways. And so looking at different countries can sometimes tell us that our policy options are very narrow, whatever the political system we have. Okay, next. So, if we want to compare Brazil, who should we compare it with? And I want to illustrate some of the problems of comparison by referring to one study that I was involved in Europe. Next slide. The aims of the study were to determine whether and to what extent there is convergence in domestic sport policy systems in 4 countries. And the second aim was to understand the factors responsible for convergence. We were also concerned, at the bottom line there, with high-performance sport. So we were particularly concerned with high-performance sport. Okay, next slide. So rather than choosing countries that were very different, we chose countries that, in many respects, were the same. And I would ask you that if you were selecting countries that were similar to Brazil, what would they be? Now, we chose as our variables economic variables or economic development, and then, as you'll see on the next slide, sport development. So the 4 countries, Canada, England, Germany, and Norway, they vary in terms of population quite very considerably. But in terms of economic structure and economic development, we saw them as being broadly similar. So we were choosing countries that were economically broadly similar. Next slide. We also looked at what is known as the Gini Index, and generally speaking, the lower the figure, the more evenly wealth is distributed in the country. And this gives you an indication of some of the differences between the 4 countries that we studied. That Norway, which has a reputation for being a social democratic country, has the most equal distribution of wealth. And England, which is a neoliberal, free market political system, has the greatest inequality in distribution. And I'll come back to this point in a moment. Next slide. In terms of sport, we chose countries that had a well-established high-performance sports system. They were countries that, as you can see, had hosted the Olympic Games at least twice, whether it's summer or winter games. that in terms of Olympic success, they were broadly similar. That is, they were generally successful either in summer or winter games. In terms of individual sports, athletics and football, again, reasonably successful. So in terms of economic development and sports development, we were choosing similar countries. Next slide. Where we wanted to ask a research question was in terms of political system. And as I showed on an earlier slide, with the distribution of wealth, there was considerable difference in how wealth was distributed in those countries. And here you can see how we organized those countries. We wanted countries that represented what we call a liberal welfare regime. In other words, they were broadly neoliberal economies. So Canada and the UK came in that category. We had one country which represented a sort of left-of-centre social democratic political system, and one country which represented what is called a conservative welfare regime, that is one based around a Christian heritage, a Christian tradition, particularly a Protestant Christian tradition, and Germany was the example that we chose. And in terms of those differences, the liberal welfare regime has a commitment to a small state, that problems, whether they're social problems, sporting problems, the ideology is that they are best solved by the commercial sector, by the free market. That the state is there as a safety net when other processes fail. The social democratic welfare regime is much more accepting of an idea that the state has a major role to play in delivering benefits, whether those are welfare or sporting benefits, for the whole society. So you have a program of universal benefits rather than selective benefits. The conservative welfare regime, social security systems are based on occupational schemes and corporatist status divisions. And at the bottom, the family is the central caregiver and ultimately responsible for its members' welfare. And in terms of sport, it would argue that sport is the responsibility of families. That sport is part of physical education, are family responsibilities rather than necessarily state responsibilities. So those three different welfare regimes. Okay, next slide. Now, without going into the details of how we did the research, I just want to re-skip to the conclusions we came to, because those are particularly relevant for your discussions today. We did find that there was a high degree of convergence, that is, despite selecting countries from three different political traditions, they all developed their elite or high-performance athletes in broadly similar ways. Now, the question that this raises is, for some policy problems, in other words, or the example we're using here, is producing successful high-performance athletes. For that problem, is there only one way of doing it? And this convergence, does it demonstrate that there is only one way of solving that problem, of producing a successful Olympic squad? Policy is driven by central government. In other words, even in federal states like Canada and Germany, and Brazil as a federal state, a key role was taken by central government, that it drove the high-performance sports system rather than leaving it to the states or the provinces. Thirdly, in all those countries, if you ask the question, do those countries have a national high-performance sports policy? In one respect, the answer is no. What they all have is the IOC's high-performance sport policy. And if I take an example from Britain, when the IOC dropped wrestling from the Olympic programme, we stopped funding wrestling. When the IOC reinstated wrestling, we started funding wrestling. The British high-performance sport policy is the IOC's high-performance sport policy. And again, for all the countries that we looked at, their policy was dictated by the IOC. They were never admitted, but it was true. Considerable policy learning and policy transfer, and this is a point I'll come back to on the next slide. But all the countries we looked at invested considerable resources in intelligence gathering, that is, looking at what other countries were doing and transferring what they saw as examples of good practice, learning from each other. And finally, evidence of what I call path dependency. And this is, I think, very relevant for the development of policy here in Brazil. What I mean by path dependency is that once you take a step on the path towards Olympic success, once the government decides that this is a priority, to do well at the Olympic Games, to be in the top 10 or the top 5 of the medals table, that's an important first step. You then invest in maybe specialist facilities, that's a second step. You then invest in allowing your athletes to train full-time, that's another step. Each step you take, does it make it more and more difficult to leave that path, to say, we're as successful as we want to be? In Britain, if you looked at the last 12 Olympic Games, going back to the 1950s, from about 1950s to the 1990s, Britain came either 10th or 14th in the medals table, somewhere around that. It was very, very consistent. One or two exceptions, but very, very consistent. Then the government decided we wanted to be more successful than that, and it began to invest considerable sums of money in high-performance sport. And our medal position improved to 8th, to 4th, to 3rd. Now, it'd be a brave government that says, we're spending too much money on high-performance sport, we want to drop down the medals table to 8th or 9th. A brave government that would say that. And at the moment, our present government is saying, we were very successful in London, it was our home games, but we want to be even more successful when the games come to Rio. Now, no country has been more successful after their home games. So the government is going even further along that path and spending more and more money to try and achieve that objective. So path dependency is a risk for policy. It locks you in to a policy, maybe. Next. In terms of trying to identify what were the key elements of a successful high-performance sports system, these were some of the conclusions we came to. What did they all have in those 4 countries? Well, first of all, they had specialist training facilities. Nearly always it was a national training facility, simply because the resources you needed of coaching expertise, scientific expertise is rare. So you needed to concentrate it in one national centre. So a national centre was quite common, or at least 2, maybe, regional centres. All countries found some way of enabling their athletes to train full-time. So, for example, in Britain, we simply pay our athletes a salary to be full-time. In Germany, for their Winter Olympic athletes, nearly all of their winter squad are in the army. So they are paid as soldiers, but they are really full-time athletes. All the countries were in the process of investing heavily in specialist facilities. Coaches, sports science, and career management of athletes. And the career management was important in stopping potential medal-winning athletes dropping out before Olympic Games. That is, making sure that they felt confident they had a career after their sports career. A competition pathway, that is, all competitions lead towards the Olympic Games. In the past, in all those 4 countries, domestic championships, national championships often got in the way of Olympic preparation. But over the years, they've said all competitions must lead towards the Olympic Games or the World Cup or whatever the priority is. 5th is intelligence gathering. That's not just in the 4 countries that we looked at, but in a number of other countries that I've looked at. They all have a unit within their ministry or their sports agency or their National Olympic Committee that does nothing else except gather intelligence about what other countries are doing and what academic researchers are doing. And their job is to translate that research into useful information for particular sports. But countries like South Korea and Japan they have large units, many people who do this job full time, and they do it very, very successfully. So intelligence gathering, really important. And finally, what we saw emerging is a process of talent transfer. And there are 2 types of talent transfer. One is from one country to another. Roughly 10% of all the athletes who took part in the London Olympic Games were not born in the country they represented. They were transferred in and given citizenship from other countries. That's one form of talent transfer. And it wasn't just rich Middle Eastern countries that were doing this, although Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain spent a lot of money buying athletes from other countries. But rich countries did it. Canada, the United States, Britain, they all involved in this form of talent transfer. Another form of talent transfer was transfer between sports. And in Britain, there were a number of schemes to transfer athletes who were very, very good at one sport, but were never going to be world class. And to say, do you want to try another sport? So, in particular, we have lots of football academies, as I'm sure you have here in Brazil. Now, maybe only 5% of the members of football academies will play for a first-class team. But the other 95%, many of them are great athletes. Are there other sports that they could try? And a number of athletes who won medals for Britain in London didn't start in the sport that they were winning a medal in. Rowing, cycling, a lot of them transferred from other sports. So talent transfer, both from countries and from sports, is increasingly important. Okay. In terms of just looking at the methodology, these are questions I will leave with you. Whether our selection of countries was convincing. Should we have chosen other countries? Was it a good selection? Did we identify the most salient variables, that is, economic development and sporting success? Should we have looked at maybe smaller, less economically developed countries and see what they did? Would we have learned more by looking at different countries? And finally, was it appropriate to treat sport as an element of welfare? And for me, one of the fascinating aspects of studying sport is that I'm not sure what category it fits in. Is it international relations? Is it economic development? Is it welfare? Is it education? Is it part of the health system? That over time, its definition changes, and we defined it as being part of welfare, but maybe we should have seen it as part of economic development or international relations, diplomacy, rather than simply welfare. Okay. The second example is a major study which is involving a number of countries across the world, and it's the SPLIS study, Sport Policy Factors Leading to International Success. The next slide. And the SPLIS study makes some interesting observations about how do you explain the relative success of countries. And it looks at what it calls macro, meso, micro levels. And I will look at those in turn. The next slide. At the macro level, if you're looking down the ranking of Olympic medals, half of the variation in success can be explained by two factors: the population of a country and the wealth of a country. Now, those are fairly obvious variables to explain success. But it's the remaining 50% of variance which is interesting. That urbanization, the degree of urbanization, affects the level of success. The more urbanized the country is, or the population of the country is, the more likely it is to be successful. Simply because if you are a long jumper and you want to train with other long jumpers, you're more likely to find other long jumpers in a big city than if you live in a rural area. That in those specialist disciplines, you need a large city to be able to find people to compete against and train with and to be coached by. Geography. Very obvious, if you have mountains and a cold climate, it's a good topography for winter sports. Or if you are landlocked, then sailing is tricky. Political system. Historically, the most successful political systems for producing successful high-performance sports systems were the communist countries. So the former Soviet Union, the former East Germany, with the help of doping, they did produce very, very successful high-performance sports systems. Outside that category, then the political ingredient which is most important for high-performance success is stability. Almost irrespective of whether it's democratic or authoritarian, as long as the system is stable, there is a relationship between stability and success. Religion is interesting that Muslim countries, partly because of the problem they have with accepting female athletes, they are the least successful, and Protestant countries seem to be the most successful. Historically, about 50% of Olympic medals have been won by countries where the dominant religion is Protestantism. Cultural and social values. This is a very broad category, but it's what value does your society, or does the society give to sport? That in some countries, Japan, Taiwan, Southeast Asia, sport for children is seen as being frivolous, that sport in schools is a waste of time, that what children should be doing is science, mathematics, other academic subjects. Sport is something you can do maybe at the weekend, but even then, the time would be better spent studying. So culturally, sport doesn't have a high social value. In most Europe or Western European countries, sport tends to have a higher cultural or social value. In Brazil, I would think there's a very positive social attitude towards sport, but maybe it's more positive towards football than towards Olympic sport. That is, if you ask people what would it be more important to win the Football World Cup or to be high in the Olympic medals table, it would be interesting to know what the answer would be. So the cultural value is significant. Okay. Other middle range values or factors is whether sport is prominent in schools. That countries that teach children basic hand-eye coordination, basic physical literacy, tend to be more successful. Countries that have a system for identifying potential talent early tend to be more successful. So, at what age do you, or do your sports in Brazil identify potential distance runners or track and field athletes? The suggestion is that if it's done early, then it's more likely to be successful. So sport embedded within the school system, not something that takes place after school, but something which is part of the core curriculum. Fourthly, that there is a qualification system for coaches, and that coaches have a system for regularly updating their skills. That, again, I don't know the Brazilian system, but is there a hierarchy of coaching qualifications? Is there a process by which, once a coach qualifies, he or she is regularly updated with the latest information about sports science, about coaching techniques elsewhere? Good funding for sports science, physiology, psychology, nutrition, all this contributes to high-performance success. And finally, investment in sports medicine, the recovery from injury, the protection of athletes against injury, again, is a valuable element of a successful high-performance sports system. Okay. What the early SPLIS study also did is to ask three groups, athletes, coaches, and PD, or performance directors, what they saw as the most important ingredients in a successful high-performance sports system. And there's some variation, but it's generally a high level of agreement that personal environment of the young athlete and elite athletes is high for both the athletes and also their coaches. So, looking at the way in which the individual athlete experiences the system is crucial. What does the system look like from their point of view is crucial in keeping them happy and committed. And then, I won't go through all of these, but the sports systems during an athlete career, that there's a lot of evidence that as athletes get older and get near to their peak of performance, they start worrying about what happens when they pass their peak of performance. When they're 25, 26, and thinking, I've got another 40 years of work ahead of me, what am I going to do? They need reassurance that they will be protected, they will have educational opportunities, employment opportunities, and that provides the reassurance to stay committed to their sport. Quality of coaches, training, competition opportunities, a very familiar list, and I will leave this presentation with the university, and I'm sure they will allow access to it, so you can look at this in more detail. The next slide. A similar set of questions asked in different countries, Ireland, the United States, and Flanders, which is part of Belgium. And again, asking what are the ingredients to successful systems? And the list is very similar. Personal factors, social support, that is support from family, from community, was important. Coaching, financial support. There's a high degree of consensus about what is necessary for a successful high-performance sports system. Okay. And what the SPLIS study produced was this model here of 9 different pillars or ingredients or elements of a successful high-performance sports system. Now, I need to say that although the SPLIS study is, I think, an excellent study, what it identifies is individual elements. It doesn't tell you how they're put together to make a system. And that is a crucial question, that all these individual bits seem to be very significant in producing high-performance success. But the real secret is how do you put them together so that they work cooperatively and reinforce each other? And that's a more tricky question. Okay. What you can produce from the SPLIS system is this kind of what's called a radar diagram, where the red line is the average for all countries, or the countries in their sample. And you can map on top of that. I've given the example here of Britain, but you could map Brazil on top of that, and you would ask, in terms of coaching, where is Brazil, training facilities, career support, and so on. And you can see that in some areas, the United Kingdom does particularly well, like athlete career support, but in other areas we do particularly badly. Scientific research, which surprises me, but also coaching we're seen as being not very successful, partly because we buy coaches from other countries rather than develop them ourselves. Okay. Right. Coming on to the final section of my presentation is looking at the implications of some of this research. And most research ignores small countries, less successful, and poorer countries. Now, there are 2 implications of that. Does it mean we have nothing to learn from them? And I think that's not true. That I think poorer countries have to innovate. They have to be imaginative. Maybe we can learn a lot from them. And also less successful countries. There are good examples of countries, Malaysia is one, which has invested huge amounts of money in producing all those elements of the SPLIS study, and yet it is spectacularly unsuccessful. What are they doing wrong? They have all the ingredients, but it still doesn't work. Okay. So in terms of wealth, depending how you count countries in the world, there's roughly 220, 230. The range in wealth is enormous, and the median wealth is around 9,000 US dollars. Brazil, 11,000, just under 12,000 US dollars. A huge range. Only 64 countries are above $20,000 per capita. So the majority of the world's countries are relatively poor. Most southern Eastern European countries are $15,000 to $30,000, and many prominent sports countries are poor countries. Now, what are they doing that we could learn from? Countries like Kenya, Jamaica, Ethiopia, Nigeria, who are relatively successful. Okay. And most countries are small. The majority of the world's countries are small states. 242 states, 90 of a population below 1.5 million. Is there anything that a country the size of Brazil or the UK could learn from small countries? Just going down to the bottom of the slide, of the 205 countries that participated in the London Olympic Games, 41 sent fewer than 5 athletes, and 95 sent fewer than 10 athletes. That the Olympics is dominated, just as the World Cup is dominated, by rich, generally rich, but certainly high population countries. Okay. So when we analyse the distribution of medals and I'm looking just at the Olympic Games, what do we find? We find a tremendous stability in the distribution of medals. Over here, from 88 to 2012, a steady increase in the number of countries that participate in the Olympic Games. The number of countries winning at least one medal has also increased. But the percentage of countries has remained remarkably stable. If a country wants to break in to that sort of inner circle of successful medal-winning countries, it's tough. The pattern is stability. Despite a lot of changes by Olympic federations to try and engineer a wider distribution of medals, it's generally quite difficult to do. Okay. Here, I looked at a sample of countries that are sort of moderately successful. That is, they've won 2 gold medals over the last 4 Olympic Games. The important column is over on the right-hand side, because what you see is that all these countries rely very, very heavily on a small number of sports. The same is true even for the more successful countries. That even the United States, if you took away the medals that the United States wins in swimming, it would move down the medals table quite considerably. Without swimming, the United States would have problems. Without cycling, rowing and sailing, Britain would have serious problems. That is, all countries, but particularly these middle-ranked countries, have a concentration of effort and medals in a small number of sports. So for Brazil, what are your small number of sports? What are the 3, 4, 5 sports that you can say, these are the ones that will guarantee us medal success, where we have a historic or a scientific comparative advantage? As said for Britain, if cycling, rowing and sailing disappeared from the Olympic programme, we would disappear from the medals table. Okay, next. And here, again, similar, if you look at Kenya, 100% of its medals comes from athletics. Without athletics, and particularly distance running, Kenya would not have its medals. But even South Africa and Switzerland, 50, 60, sometimes 100% of its medals coming from just 3 sports. So all countries have sports where they have a comparative advantage. The only exception is China. It's the only country which wins medals across almost the whole range of Olympic sport. Okay. So, here's where I become more controversial. Is high-performance sport an addiction for governments? That is, once you start saying that high-performance sport is important for us, can you ever stop? Who's addicted? Well, governments, I think, national sport organisations, international federations, maybe the public, the media, is addicted to high-performance sport. So many governments, if they can afford it, they tolerate, if not indulge, unregulated international federations. The only reason England complained about corruption in FIFA is because they awarded the World Cup to Qatar and not to England. If they'd awarded it to England, FIFA would have been okay. But because they awarded it to another country, we've argued it was corrupt. Most international federations are badly run. They are not transparent organisations, and yet they are global monopolies. And governments tolerate them, and I think it's a risk. They run a great risk in tolerating these monopolistic organisations. Governments often ignore the exploitation of high-performance athletes. The high-performance system in the United States and in China they're both disgraceful. They treat athletes as disposable people. That if they, in China, they sweep up thousands and thousands of young people with the prospect of Olympic success, and 99.9% of them are abandoned with almost no education, no alternative way of earning their living in order to produce the success that China has. And the United States is not much different. The system is different, but the outcome is much the same. Governments also tend to conspire in ignoring the poor return on investment. That's, in the introduction there was a discussion of legacy. There certainly should be a legacy from hosting major sports events. But finding firm evidence of what that legacy is and measuring it is incredibly difficult. That generally speaking, there is mixed evidence about the economic legacy. There is stronger evidence about an almost psychological legacy. That is, the people in the country feel better. Now, how do you measure that? And how do you argue that for London, we spent £10 billion, about 15 billion US dollars, hosting the London Olympics. It was successful, it was publicly very well supported, but how do you measure the psychological benefits of it? And governments tend to invest more heavily in high-performance sport than in community sport. And I'll show you some figures from a range of countries. And it's partly because it's easier to measure your medal return for high-performance sport than the return you get for community sport. Okay, next. And these are the examples here. This is just a selection. I've got a much longer list. All these countries, there has been a tremendous increase in the amount of government investment in high-performance sport, usually producing more medal success, but not always, not for Spain, for example. But New Zealand, the budget for community sport increased by 5% between 2009 and 2013. The budget for elite sport by 57%, and their medal success did increase. So 25th in the medals table in 2008, but 15th in 2012. So that was a successful investment, but maybe at the cost of community sport. And I won't go through all the others, but the pattern is broadly similar. That governments increasing the amount of money that they spend on high-performance systems. And one question that needs to be asked is, what proportion of that increase is simply to keep up with the others? That is, to stay where you are. That you need to spend more money to stay where you are, and then even more money if you want to overtake some other countries. Okay. One significant problem that I've touched on is about poor governance. That a problem in too many international sports federations, their quality of corporate governance is disgraceful. That in terms of transparency, which means can you see their constitution, can you see the minutes of meetings, 89% have no published criteria for distribution of funding. It's done secretly. 66% have no audit committee. In terms of democratic accountability, no representation of stakeholders, athletes in particular, in 20%. No decision-making power for stakeholders in 80%. So some might be represented, but they have no influence. No code of ethics in just over half. No ethics committee in 66%. These are badly run organisations. And when governments deal with them, they need to be very careful and very aware of the type of organisations that they're dealing with. Okay. And then coming on to the poisoned issue of doping in sport. And this is a quote from a recent investigation by the World Anti-Doping Agency. And it says, the primary reason for the apparent lack of success of the testing programs do not lie with the science. The real problems are human and political factors. There is no general appetite to undertake the effort and the expense of a successful effort to deliver doping-free sport. This applies with varying degrees at the level of athletes, international sport organisations, national Olympic committees, national anti-doping organisations and governments. That our efforts to deal with the problem of doping are failing. And I think part of the explanation is that a successful high-performance system is seen as more important than drug-free sport. Next slide. And if we look at countries which have a poor reputation, then unfortunately I think Brazil is among them. That in recent years, Brazil, in hosting the two most important sports events in the world, has been severely criticised by the WADA International Observers Report, particularly for the last Pan American Games. It's on WADA's list of non-compliant governments, and recently its doping laboratory was suspended. That is not a good record for a country that is hosting these two most important events. And this is not good company to keep of India and Russia, which have more athletes suspended for doping than any other countries in the world. So, is the priority given to high-performance sport a problem? Well, we could say it's nothing to worry about. That because high-performance sport is so prominent, it does bring money to community sport and to youth sport. Maybe not very much, but if governments weren't concerned with high-performance sport, maybe community sport and youth sport would get even less money. So that's a positive interpretation. Community sport is financially, ideologically, politically, organisationally dependent on high-performance sport. But in other words, it needs high-performance sport if it's going to survive. Also, high-performance sport, and particularly success, is seen as good marketing, good recruitment for community sport. It engages young people, it encourages them to participate in sport. And those are positive spillovers. On the other hand, we could say that if we ask the question, can governments ever break the habit of high-performance sport? We say no. Path dependency makes it very, very difficult. As I said, it'd be a brave British government that would say, we're no longer interested in being high up the medals table at the Summer Olympic Games. Resource dependency of international federations and national sport organisations on commercial and public patrons is too strong. That is, that link, particularly with the sports media, is too strong. And for an increasingly professional management, high-performance sports objectives are easier organisational objectives to achieve than community sport objectives. For the last 40 or 50 years, in not just Britain, but most European countries, they have been attempting to get more people like me to do more sport, generally without success. That if you were to put the participation figures on a graph, they are remarkably steady. It's a really tough job to change the level of participation. And we could argue for health reasons, for all sorts of social reasons, for most of our countries, that's the real challenge. But in terms of investment in high-performance sport, you can look at the medals table and you can say, yes, that investment has paid off. And that is an easier measure or key performance indicator than for community sport. Thank you very much.
Bom, gostaria de agradecer, já comentei com o professor Barrie sobre a sua brilhante palestra. Só antes da palestra, quero só fazer um comunicado que tem um carro HTX 4054, que está atrapalhando o trânsito. Essa plaquinha já passou aí pelos corredores algumas vezes. Quem tivesse esse carro já foi multado e já está na segunda fase do guincho. Bom, nós vamos abrir para as perguntas. Quem tiver perguntas, nós vamos deixar 2 microfones, a Tati e o Alisson com o Sr. Barão. Gentileza, Alisson. Por favor, se identificar.
Muito obrigado, professor. Eu gostaria de estar fazendo dois questionamentos, ou solicitando duas intervenções. Meu nome é José Varela, eu trabalho na área mais voltada para desenvolvimento motor. E na segunda parte da sua fala, na segunda sessão, o senhor trouxe um aspecto muito importante relacionado à prática de educação física e à prática nos anos iniciais na formação dos atletas, na formação do desenvolvimento de futuros atletas. Na terceira sessão, na terceira parte da sua fala, o senhor já chamou a atenção para que, em termos de políticas públicas, há necessidade de focar em algumas modalidades específicas para que a gente então consiga ter maior sucesso. Como equacionar, como trabalhar com esses dois aspectos, considerando que na educação física não seria o ideal de estar realmente direcionando para as modalidades ou para algumas poucas modalidades. Então eu gostaria que o senhor fizesse a gentileza de comentar a respeito desse assunto. Obrigado.
Thank you. That's a very important question. That in most education systems, the specialist physical education is much stronger in high schools than in junior schools. So there is a real need for good physical education in junior schools, but I think there is a difference between physical education and learning particular sports. So you can learn at a very general level confidence in your body's ability to move, to be athletic, but that is a general skill. The next level is to learn some more specific sports-related skills, and it might be hand-eye coordination, the ability to identify and select movement, which can be applied to many sports. So I think the important thing is developing children's confidence in their bodies and producing or developing those general skills. There is quite a bit of research that suggests that good specialist athletes were good at lots of sports when they were young. And I think it depends on the particular sport, but for most sports, it's good for children to play a lot of sports that they enjoy, because the enjoyment is crucial. And then select specialize a little bit later on, maybe in their early or middle teenage years. But it is that fundamental enjoyment of using your body physically, confidence in your body, when you're 7, 8, 9, 10, that is the important part. And the specialism comes later and comes more easily if you have that pool of children with that confidence and those basic skills.
Bom dia, meu nome é Wagner Romão, eu sou capitão do Exército, atualmente gerenciando o programa de atletas de alto rendimento no Exército e nas Forças Armadas. A minha pergunta é com relação à sua análise nessa nova política pública que vários países vêm adotando, que é a inclusão de atletas de alto rendimento nas Forças Armadas, associando um atleta que traz junto com ele aí diversos atributos inerentes ao desporto de alto rendimento e semelhantes também à carreira militar. Como vocês analisam essa nova política pública de inclusão de atletas de alto rendimento ao redor do mundo, se vocês têm esse acompanhamento e qual seria a sua análise para essa política?
In the countries that I'm familiar with, the athletes who are in the armed forces, they do some basic military training, but they spend most of their time under the supervision of non-military coaches. So they are in a very privileged position in terms of being in the armed forces, and whether they would be successful soldiers, I'm not sure, because the priority is that they should be successful athletes. So even in, certainly in South Korea, where there is a requirement that all young men spend 2 years in the military service, if they are talented athletes, their involvement in military training is not very great. And even in Germany, they are treated as special members of the armed forces. So I think they are first athletes, and second, they are members of the armed forces. So, as I said, whether they would be good soldiers, I'm not sure, but they would be good athletes. So they have a special privileged status.
Alessandra.
Oi. Meu nome é Alessandra, professor. Tive o privilégio de te ouvir ontem e hoje também. Acredito que as informações que o senhor nos trouxe são muito importantes, né? Inclusive os estudos que o senhor apresentou, acredito que são novos, né? E se possível o senhor pudesse disponibilizar, porque a gente não pôde ver as referências. A minha pergunta é em relação a estudos comparativos de política pública de esporte. O senhor falou, né, sobre várias questões que a gente tem que analisar ao se fazer um estudo comparativo. Semelhanças entre os países, em relação à economia, cultura e vários outros aspectos. Mas a minha questão vai em outro sentido. Eu li os dois livros que o senhor escreveu, de estudos comparativos, e neles é feita uma consideração que o senhor colocou aqui sobre a questão da pet dependence, mas não se analisa os fatores que geram essa pet dependence, essa dependência de trajetória. Então eu penso, a gente desconsidera muitas vezes a história, né, daqueles países, de como eles chegaram naquele patamar, porque no estudo é feito um recorte temporal. Então eu comparo países que naquele momento estão naquele patamar. O senhor acredita que seria possível um estudo no qual eu possa comparar esses países, considerando essa dependência de trajetória no aspecto institucional? Porque, como o senhor falou, os países vão desenvolver diferentes níveis de resposta organizacional para desenvolver a política de esporte. Né? E talvez a gente possa ter um aprendizado com essa política, né? Talvez não pensar em transferência, mas em aprendizado. Obrigada.
Yes, thanks for that question. I think the concept of path dependency is attractive, but it's also a very loose concept. I think to make it more specific, I think the way to analyse or to test the extent of path dependence is to think of the development of policy maybe in three stages. And here, I apologise, I must refer to Britain because it's the country I'm most familiar with. That if we go back maybe 30 years, 40 years, the government had a general interest in sport, but it was quite content to give sport organisations a little bit of money and say, get on with it, do what you want with that money. So there was no path dependence, but there was an interest, and maybe that's the first step. After maybe 15, 20 years, government policy became maybe more sophisticated or more precise. They started talking about sport in terms of sport for young people, sport for the community, and sport for the high performance. So they were beginning to see three different areas. And you could see that as a transition stage from a sort of a general interest to a more specific identification of policy areas. And then I think you move along to maybe in each of those three, there is a path or a trajectory where at some stage a government has invested so much political status as well as money in, for example, if I take a different example, getting more young people to be physically active, that it is locked into that policy. Now, that concept of locking in, again, needs to be investigated. How would we recognise it? So in abstract, I can identify the concept. In practice of, saying in terms of German or Brazilian or British school sport policy or youth sport policy, what was the crucial decision or stage where this policy became locked in? That is, I don't have an easy answer to that, but I think that is the crucial question. I think I would also say that path dependency suggests that once a policy is locked in, nothing is impossible. It's not impossible to say enough is enough. That is, we are not going to have invest any more money in school sport or high performance sport. But the question that needs to be asked is, how big a crisis or change of government ideology do you need in order to bring about that movement off that path? And the further along the path you go, the bigger the earthquake needs to be before you change direction. But again, it's easy in abstract to say that that's what you're looking for, but to pin it down precisely is much more difficult. If I just give a non-sport example, that in the UK at the moment there is a big debate about whether we should continue to have nuclear weapons. We've had nuclear weapons for the last 60 years. They are incredibly expensive. We have no idea who we would use them against. but we still have them. Are we locked onto that path, that it is so much part of our military strategy that no government could say we are going to cease to be a nuclear power, we will now be a conventional weapons power. Even though I think it costs something like 20 billion or 30 billion US dollars to maintain our nuclear submarines. Total waste of money. But it would be a brave government that say we are no longer going to be part of that nuclear club. And is that an example of path dependency? What would it need to say we're going to stop? We're not going to buy Trident from the United States anymore. So I think in all policy areas you can ask these questions, but I do accept your point that making the transition from a theoretical model to a practical analysis is challenging, but it's exciting in the same way.
Flávia.
Bom dia, professor. Prazer revê-lo. Já tive o prazer de ouvi-lo em outros congressos no México. Eu queria, agora vou me apresentar, sou Flávia Bastos, da Escola de Educação Física e Esporte da Universidade de São Paulo, e a gente teve o privilégio de participar dessa pesquisa dos FLIs como o representante do Brasil no consórcio internacional, e por isso minha pergunta é bem específica, mas eu acho que específica também em relação à própria temática do evento. O senhor comentou que o Reino Unido, e até se espantou um pouco, que teve uma avaliação negativa em relação ao papel da ciência, né, dos 9 pilares, o papel da ciência no desenvolvimento do esporte no Reino Unido. E nós aqui no Brasil também, entre outros itens, naquele gráfico do radar, aliás, foi o item pior avaliado, né, pelos pesquisadores e pela comunidade de técnicos, atletas e dirigentes que responderam à pesquisa. Então, eu queria que o senhor falasse um pouquinho mais, né, dessa sua avaliação no Reino Unido, que me pareceu que o senhor não concordou muito com os resultados, e como então o senhor vê, eu acho que é o tema central desse nosso encontro aqui, como que a ciência poderia, o que acontece lá no Reino Unido, no sentido de colaborar para o desenvolvimento do esporte de alto rendimento. Obrigada.
First of all, hello again. Yeah, I think there is a difference between a country developing a sports science capacity, that is a research capacity in its universities and sports institutes, and a country using science. Because certainly in the UK, we are very good at using the science developed in other countries. So translating the science that has taken place in the United States, Canada, Japan, Russia, and so on. But we're still slow to develop our own scientific capacity. Having said that, I think we have a lot of sports science, but not so much applied sports science. And it is that difference which is maybe a problem for our universities, and maybe a problem for all universities, that as academics, we are more interested in pure scientific research rather than applied scientific research. And bringing those two together is a real policy challenge. A similar problem in terms of coaching science is in the UK we score badly for coaching, partly because we are not good at developing our own British coaches, but we are excellent at stealing coaches from other countries. So for the 26 Summer Olympic sports, the performance director or head coach of 20 of them was not British. We have Germans, we have Americans, Canadians, Australians. They are great coaches. We simply buy them. So if you ask the question, as SPLIS does, how good is a country at developing its own coaching capacity, we score badly. But in terms of buying in good coaches, we do.
Murilo.
Sou Murilo, da Universidade Federal da Bahia, trabalho no Diagnóstico Nacional do Esporte. A minha pergunta para o professor é: nós estamos em um mundo e uma sociedade que cada vez nos empurra mais para o exacerbamento da competição. E o professor também diz da necessidade de desenvolvimento do prazer pelo esporte, né? A pergunta é: de que maneira essas duas questões podem ser confrontadas, principalmente a partir da visão um pouco mais reduzida que nós temos do esporte, que é a visão do esporte enquanto somente o esporte olímpico, já que nós temos, por um outro lado, uma grande ascensão dos ditos esportes alternativos ou esportes radicais, né? E de que maneira nós podemos acomodar isso em uma política pública de esporte para além de somente as Olimpíadas e para além de somente a Copa do Mundo, né? E que sinal também, qual é o sinal que isso dá para a gente para o desenvolvimento ulterior do esporte, né? O que isso mostra para a gente que o esporte, para onde ele está avançando e para onde a população, pegando pelo community sport, para onde a população está apontando o que ela vê como um elemento central.
All right, thank you for that wonderful question. I think there are two elements to it. I think one is the future of high performance sport, and particularly the Olympic Games. That if we were to ask the question, are the Olympic Games successful? The answer would almost certainly be, of course they are. If you look at viewing figures, at the sponsorship coming into the Olympic movement, it is higher than it's ever been. But there are some very worrying statistics behind that initial picture. One important statistic is in the United States, which is the most important television market for the Summer Olympic Games, what would you say was the average age of viewers? The answer is 55 years old. Over the last 20 years, the average age of people who watch the Olympic Games has been getting steadily older and older. Now, and the Olympic movement recognises this, and their question is, are we losing a young generation who are, it's people at my age, people in their 50s and 60s, who grew up with the Olympic Games and it's part of our culture, but it's not part of the culture of young people. And when I asked many of my students, did you watch the Olympic Games? They said, yeah, some. But they weren't watching it every day. So the IOC is aware that maybe the Olympic program is losing touch with the new generation. And when you think about it, most of the sports in the Olympic program are 19th century products that you're trying to sell to a 21st century audience. It's a frozen landscape to some extent. There's some innovation. So that I think might explain the growth of radical sports, extreme sports, informal sports, that it's a youth movement. The first part of your question about the connection between high performance sport and community sport, in many European countries and in Britain in particular, we used to have an organisational diagram in a pyramid or a triangle, and at the bottom was a foundation, which was what children did at school, basic sports. It then went to participation, which was adult general participation sport, then performance, which was more competitive adult sport, and then excellence at the top. And the assumption was that these four levels were intimately interconnected, that is, you couldn't have one without the other. But increasingly, I think you can. You do not need thousands and thousands of people doing track and field to identify the 20 or 30 who will make up your Olympic squad. most federations are looking for ways, and I mentioned some like talent transfer, of shortcutting that process. So I think there's a real problem here of a disconnection between high-performance sport and community and youth sport. How we solve that problem, I don't know. That the majority of Olympic sports are now so highly technical and highly scientific that the amateur would never be successful. Maybe only in distance running. That might be the only sport, and again I'm not an expert in this field, but it might be the only sport where the gifted, talented amateur could come from the highlands of Kenya and win an Olympic medal. But in high jump, most track and field, they are so scientific that you need to invest huge sums of money to make a person a medalist. I can't see a way in which we will close that gap. And I think it is a real problem for politicians to demonstrate that the investment in high-performance sport and Olympic success will generate benefits for the community. I don't think it's impossible, but I think it is becoming more difficult and more challenging.
Mais alguém? Então, eu gostaria de agradecer muito a palestra do professor Barrie. Para nós, que estamos desenvolvendo um projeto sobre a questão do esporte de alto rendimento, sobre maneira a questão do esporte no país, o quanto é importante o debate acadêmico para fundamentar nosso projeto, e quanto é importante para o esporte brasileiro esse debate acadêmico. Eu gostaria, então, em nome de toda a comissão do evento, agradecer a presença do Dr. Barrie aqui hoje e comunicar que estaremos no início da tarde, às 13h30, já dando sequência à palestra do Ricardo, secretário nacional do Ricardo Leise, e tem alguns recados ali, Tatiana. Obrigado. Thank you very much.
Foi avisado pelo pessoal da tradução simultânea que quem for voltar de tarde, se quiser ficar com o equipamento, pode ficar. Daí quem for embora já deixa ali, só para não ter muito trânsito ali na bancada do pessoal da tradução.